Welcome to our global conversations here on Carib Explore Television. I'm your host, Ian Boxer. Our Global Conversations is a program that discusses global issues through Caribbean lenses. From August 22 to 24 of this year, the nations of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, or the BRICS bloc, met in Johannesburg, South Africa for their annual Leaders Summit. Now, the name BRICS was first used in 2001 by Jim O'Neill, an economist at Goldman Sachs, to describe economies that were growing rapidly then. Brazil, Russia, India, and China were later joined by South Africa in 2010. Collectively, the 5 members of BRICS constitute 33% of global GDP, that is, purchasing power parity, 42% of global population, and 20% of the world's land surface. At the recent meeting in Johannesburg, it was agreed that 6 new members, Argentina, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, would be admitted to this bloc in 2024. With this expansion, BRICS will become a truly global group with some of the largest economies in Africa, the Americas, Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. The expansion of BRICS from 5 to 11 countries means that the bloc will represent almost 50% of the world's population. Now, what does this mean for the hegemony of the West? Should countries in the South, such as us in the Caribbean, seek closer association with this bloc? These and other issues will be the focus of today's discussion on our global conversations here on Carib Explore Television. To help me to discuss these issues are co-hosts Akeem White and Andrew McDaniel, both of whom are postgraduate students at the University of the West Indies here in Jamaica, studying international relations and political science, respectively. First to my co-hosts, Andrew and Akeem. Akeem, what is your take on the recent discussion to expand BRICS, especially given the fact that the BRICS now constitute 11 countries rather than the original 5?
I think the addition of countries from different parts of the world demonstrates a sort of amplification of the voices of countries that didn't traditionally have a significant say in international relations. Countries in the Middle East, countries in Latin America, countries in Africa, for example. I think it's also significant that the new additions to this, to BRICS, this emerging geopolitical and economic bloc, I think it's significant because all the new countries that have been added are economic poles in their own respective parts of the world. Egypt and Ethiopia, for example, some of the largest and most stable economies in Africa. Argentina, the second largest economy in Latin America. And of course, the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, 2 of the largest oil exporting countries in the world. I think these new members, because the diversity in economic resources that they have, it is promising for BRICS because now these resources can be exploited. I think the fact that there's also such a wide cross-section of countries from different parts of the world, it also adds to the legitimacy of BRICS and will eventually encourage more countries to want to join because of that legitimacy.
Well, when it comes down to BRICS, or BRICS Plus as we call it now, we have to raise 2 questions. 1, sustainability, and 2, purpose, right? Because we have to look at, will BRICS survive? Now, thing that persons tend to forget when it comes down to discussing BRICS is that it's an economic bloc. Their purpose is mostly economic, right? They're not a formal multilateral organization like the UN per se. So because of that, we have to ask ourselves, when it comes down to political intervention and the individual politics of these BRICS countries, how does that affect the relationship? Let me give you an example. The border crisis going on right now with India and China and their tense relationship, for want of a better term, how does that now affect the stability or the structure of the organization that is BRICS in itself and their relationship in terms of having some level of unity as it relates to economic cooperation, right? So I always ask myself this: when it comes on to political cooperation, can we really exclude it from an organization such as BRICS? Yeah? Because we have to think about politics and about thinking about economic cooperation. Because one country will do something that the other country is not necessarily in agreement with, right?
Well, you mentioned two heavyweight countries, well, there are three: Russia, China, and India. But we know that China is now, in terms of the size of this GDP, is second only to the United States. Russia, which has a 1 point something trillion economy, is somewhat smaller. But nonetheless, we know that there are emerging tensions between China and India. How do these countries resolve these tensions in an organization which seeks to cooperate rather than to engage in more competitive type activities? How would these two countries get along in the context of this expanded BRICS?
That's such an interesting question. And I think the future and longevity of BRICS will be key. Will completely be dependent upon how well they manage to resolve their geopolitical differences. Because if you look at new countries, the difference between economic development, foreign policy objectives, geopolitical objectives is just so potent. So, for example, there is existing competition between India and China, existing contention between Ethiopia and Egypt, existing contentions between Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. So the success of BRICS will lay upon how well they will set aside these differences. But I think the benefits that BRICS has to offer these states, if they set aside these challenges, I think it's too significant for them not to come up with strategies to put aside the beef that they have. So I think it's going to be key. I think ultimately they will find a way to work around it, because they know the benefits await them, and they know that they can only reap these benefits if they put the beef aside, for want of a better phrase.
What about you, Andrew? What's your?
I think it's a matter of, if I should make a prediction in my audacity, right, is that BRICS is really on, let me say, very tense ground, or it's on glass floor right now, because the countries involved find themselves very controversial countries, because as we're seeing now with the current Russia-Ukraine conflict, and I hope our guest speaks a lot more on that later on, as we're seeing now, they have to pick a side in some sense. And even India is playing a very dangerous game right now in trying to align themselves with the G7 countries and form relationships there, but still maintain that solid relationship with the countries in BRICS too as well, that has this controversial stance on these issues of foreign policy. Yeah, and even China in BRICS right now, and that, let me say, that assumption that an invasion in Taiwan is approaching soon enough. We have to think about situations like that and how that will affect the relationships in BRICS when persons have to now choose a side on whether or not they want to sanction these countries, right?
Exactly.
Okay. Well, I know that both of you have more to say on this, but we have a guest. And when we return, we'll be joined by our guest who will talk more about these tensions between China and India and other factors related to the longevity of BRICS. We'll be right back. Come journey with us as we explore the life and science of the Caribbean and its diaspora. I am Ian Boxall. Welcome to Carib Explore. Welcome back to our global conversations. We are joined by our first guest, Dr. Stephen Johnson, who is a research fellow at the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute for Social and Economic Studies here at the University of the West Indies, Mona campus. Now, Stephen, you are a political scientist, and I'm sure that over the years you have been following the developments in BRICS. What is your take on the recent summit that was held in Johannesburg?
My take is mixed in the sense that I think BRICS, that emerged as a concept in 2009, is finally coming to the fore. We're starting to get some meaning or some sense of direction. Initially, they were just a group of states who came together, but now we're seeing where they have a path or there's some strategy, so to speak. For example, when you look at somebody like China, which is looking to challenge the hegemonic status of the United States, they have signaled their intention that they would like their currency to become a global currency of trade, something that they were quite coy on before. We see where there are prominence now as it relates to Russia, for example, is using it as a means to ride out the sanction that has been imposed by the United States for their invasion of Ukraine. Where you see where other countries, such as India, for example, is now looking to Russia for crude oil. So we're starting to see some semblance. They don't have a constitution. They're questioning as to what is the purpose of BRICS. What started out as a marriage of convenience is starting to have some meaning.
What do you make of the relationship between China and India in the context of BRICS? We know that there are many disputes between China going on between China and India, and one of them, of course, relates to the border. But there are other emerging disputes, largely with respect to how they are involved with various countries and the hegemonic aspects of it. How do you see this relationship developing between China and India in the context of those difficulties or those challenges?
I don't envision that the tensions will change, and this is why I emphasize that BRICS is a marriage of convenience. So what works at the time for the different members, they will try to go there and settle it, and it is also a threat to BRICS itself being a core institution because the interests are so diverse. For example, as I said, there are existing tensions between India and China. Now, going forward, I think China is more interested in serving its interests in becoming a hegemon, as I said, as well as to get more and more countries using its currency, its yuan, as the currency of trade. As it relates to the implications for India, currently its interest is to get cheap oil from Russia. So I don't really see it going beyond that. Anything else would be speculating.
And what do you also make of the expansion of BRICS from 5 to 11 countries?
Now, this is becoming interesting. And again, I'm always looking at China because for me it is suiting China because already they have made a proposition to have their currency being used within Brexit in that they have petitioned the treasury of the different members, which signals intention. Now, in expanding BRICS, then you'd have to start to take them seriously as a threat to the United States hegemonic status. Currently, as it relates to the currency of trade, currently 90% of trade takes place in US dollars. Now, if over the next 4 or 5 years we're starting to see more and more members joining BRICS, and then less and less countries are starting to use US dollars, then we have to start to become concerned, depending on which side of the globe we're sitting on. Now, currently, members view BRICS, and this is, I guess, my opinion based on the analyzing, as a means to escape US sanctions. Because as you know, as the hegemon, with majority of the countries using your currency, it is used as a means to sanction countries. So they realize that Russia has, for example, used it as a way to circumvent the sanction that was in place on them. So if you look at the members like Egypt, Iran, these are some adversaries of the United States who are always subject to US sanctions. So more and more countries are seeing it as a vehicle to escape sanctions.
Well, I'm not too sure of Egypt. Egypt was a very,
Good ally.
very close ally
Ally.
of the United States. So I would agree that they are diverse countries, but their relationship with the United States, differ depending on which country. And Argentina, historically, they have not had a bad relationship with the United States. Most Latin American countries have always had somewhat of a turbulent relationship, but they've remained rather close to the United States, with one or two exceptions.
Given that you have mentioned Argentina, they have had currency crisis over the years. They have been famous for doing that, and I guess pegging their dollar to the years. Maybe they're looking at an alternative. We're not quite sure as yet, but I suspect that's why they're looking to join Brexit, because the core aspect of BRICS is currency. Looking to escape United States using the U.S. currency.
Having said all of that, the question is, for small developing states such as ours in the Caribbean, what does BRICS mean, or BRICS Plus in 2024? What will BRICS Plus mean for us?
Looking at the current patterns, I see it as a means of, again, escaping the fluctuations that we tie to the US dollars, that is affiliated with the US dollars. In truth and in fact, I can't pinpoint a Caribbean country that has, over the past years, been sanctioned by the United States, like within the Commonwealth Caribbean. So currently, I can't pinpoint an appeal to say, okay, X country is more likely to join BRIC in the immediate future.
Well, not so much the issue of joining, but in a situation where you had a unipolar world, moving as we move from that unipolar world into what ostensibly is now a multipolar world, wouldn't that open up space for some countries to engage in a number of development projects or take positions which they would not normally take if this BRICS would not have existed?
It certainly provides leverage because you now have an alternative. So let's say I was to do something and the United States, which is a hegemon, is looking to sanction me, then I have an option. And that was celebrated by the president of South Africa to say many African countries now, and I think it was his way of soliciting. So maybe Caribbean countries are looking and saying, look, if it is that we're restricted, maybe we can now use this as leverage. If it is that the United States is not giving us something that we want, maybe we can turn our attention there. Because for the reason for saying something like this is we realized recently the US was always hard and fast with the IMF, for example. And recently with the emergence of the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank, which is China emergence in the region, which has replaced the World Bank, they have softened their stance and are looking to be more flexible with interest rates, with their loans, etc., etc. So it's not far-fetched. But to pinpoint it immediately to say, okay, they will be getting an extra benefit to what currently exists, like from China, having China as an alternative partner, because more and more we're taking up Chinese loans as opposed to going to the established World Bank, etc., etc.
So the news then for people in the Caribbean and in small developing states, from you, based on what you've said then, is that BRICS does open up a potential space for them to engage in with various actors without necessarily following very closely what is required from the United States to engage them. My issue here is you tend to view BRICS as a means for less powerful states to escape U.S. sanctions. Are there other compelling reasons to have BRICS outside of this? South Africa is not being sanctioned by the United States, but they find it to be a very useful organization.
For example,
the United Arab Emirates are very close allies of the United States, but yet they are very active.
Remember, an ally is very temporary in an anarchic world.
Well, yeah, but
right, because maybe they're just looking for an out to say, look, we have us in a tight jacket here, then, based on the existing relationship, we can start to talk a little bit louder.
Well, one famous person said a particular country has interests, no friends, just interests. Indeed, others might view international relations in the same way. What is my interest rather than my friendship?
And international relations is dominated by realism, meaning that each country looks out for their own interests.
Precisely.
Right.
So the issue is, however, are there other compelling reasons to have a BRICS? There's a BRICS Development Bank. Doesn't that give an opportunity for countries to get loans at more preferable interest rates and engage in activities that they would not normally engage in for their own development outside of what is provided by the World Bank or the IMF?
Yes, because BRICS currently as a bloc, they're a powerful bloc. They account for, I think, 25% of world trade. As among them, we are talking about over 3 billion citizens. So if you were to form a trade bloc and you have a recognized country similar to the EU, you're looking at minimizing fluctuation, you're looking at cheaper goods moving across borders. So there's more to it. But because they don't have a constitution, because they don't have a pinpoint area, currently you just have to look at pattern and then speculate based on the evidence that you see.
Well, I'm sure there's much more that can be said about BRICS, and I'm sure that you have many more views that you would like to share with our guests. But at this point, we are going to take a break now, and thank you for the insight that you provided on this matter on the BRICS.
Okay, thank you very much.
Come journey with us as we explore the life and science of the Caribbean and its diaspora. I am Ian Boxall. Welcome to Caribbean Explore. Welcome back to our global conversations. We're now joined by Professor Johannes Maerk, who is the academic coordinator at the University of Applied Sciences, Vienna, Austria, and he coordinates the MA Diplomacy and International Relations. Welcome, Johannes.
Hello, good evening, Ian. Good to see you and good to hear from you.
We are talking about BRICS today, and the question I have for you as a political scientist and someone who's been observing BRICS for many, many years, what is your take on the recently held meeting of the leaders of BRICS in Johannesburg?
Yes, thank you for this very interesting question. Actually, I think one of the new phases BRICS now is entering is the enlargement of BRICS. As we have observed, the Global South basically joins BRICS in a first phase by some very important Global South countries, basically in a three-continental perspective. On the one hand, obviously Africa, represented by Egypt and Ethiopia. Then on the other side, obviously Latin America, Argentina, and the Asian part of the Global South, Iran and Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. What I observe here is this enlargement basically targeting towards, well, I would like to call it like a Bandung spirit reloaded. This means countries formerly and maybe still under a certain imperial linkage from the West are joining forces. And it's also interesting, once again, in this case, a conference in Johannesburg. The conference in Bandung was in Indonesia, also in a Global South country, and trying to position themselves as a sort of counterweight towards the Western countries. And I think that is maybe the most interesting part of this event and this encountering in Johannesburg.
Thank you. What do you think is the position of the EU given the recent decision to expand Brexit? Given what you've said, and I know obviously you can't speak for the EU, but from listening to what has been happening in Europe, what would you say is the position of the EU and indeed EU politicians with respect to the decision to expand BRICS to 11 countries, from 5 to 11 countries?
Yes, I think now I put myself in the perspective, as you really said, from a European EU position. That means the whole EU. I think what they observe is important. There are two important things there. First, obviously, there are also contradictions within these Global South members. Remember, one thing is very interesting. Before BRICS, actually, we had IPSA. That was not coined by the Saxon people, Saxon Goldman people, but actually that was an idea creating a space between India, Brazil, and South Africa. And the idea was joining forces, those countries with a more or less democratic structure, a multicultural structure, and a structure that up to a certain point also indicates that they are certain leaders in their respective regions. Yeah. Now I put myself again in this European perspective. So the Europeans will say, okay, on the one hand, these are countries, natural allies up to a certain point of us, because in a certain way they share some of the at least political aims like human rights, freedom of expression, other values linked usually with Western values. Yeah, and then on the other hand, obviously you have countries they are in opposite and up to a certain point challenging these values, arguing that these values are sometimes simply used for imperial reasons, as I think they also rightly pointed out, in order basically to exercise influence on Global South countries by behaving like school teachers. So there you have these countries now jointly, the original ones from BRICS, obviously China, with their idea that obviously human rights not necessarily always have to be individualistic rights, but there are also collective rights, or also the challenges of Russia in this respect. But now obviously you have other countries, they are going in the same direction, criticizing these human rights Western discourses like Saudi Arabia, Iran, up to a certain point, obviously also. Yeah. So I think the Europeans will see the contradictions between these countries, as they will point out that this is not a bloc without contradictions. Yeah, remember also the big differences in terms of border conflicts between China and India, and obviously also the special role of Iran in the Arab world. That is also clear. So as I said, I'm putting myself, you gave me this task, yeah, to see this from a European perspective. Yeah, so I would argue that this is one of these reasons why the European politicians are looking on this side. Obviously, on the other side, it's also very clear that this is an alliance of the future. This means this is an alliance up to a certain point to stand up against Western dominance, also to stand up against the overall idea when it comes to the conflict in Ukraine and Russia, that basically, as the Western would like, all sides on the Ukrainian side. We have seen that basically all of these countries, they have no sanctions imposed on Russia, and they have not behaved as the Europeans might have expected. Yeah, I think that's the other interesting part also of this newly enlarged global South bloc.
You're saying that it's a block of contradictions, right? Now, we know the stance of the G7 towards the Russia-Ukraine conflict in the sense of sanctions towards Russia. What I want from you is that we know that BRICS, as it is now, is for economic cooperation mostly. Do you ever imagine a security pact being formed between the countries in BRICS or any form of political cooperation in the future for the unit?
Yes, that's a very good question. Thank you for that question. You are completely right. It's on the one hand a sort of cooperation in the economic field with something also very striking. I mean, basically, China outweighs all other countries in terms of importance, economic importance on a global scale. Yeah, so that's also something that we have to take into consideration. That was already the case with BRICS, that basically the strongest economic power was in the hands of China. Now, on the political level, you are right. I think there it's even more difficult for them to find some sort of common basis. Because, as I said, you have there, on the one hand, Western-style democracies, yeah, where you always have, obviously, the danger, I call it like this, the danger from the perspective of these democratic countries, that the leadership changes, and then maybe they are not interested anymore in really following this BRICS enlarged group. Yeah? For example, think about right-wing politicians in India or right-wing politicians in Brazil coming back or staying, maintaining their position. So that is one issue when it comes to countries that are prone to have elections. Yes. On the other hand, yes, I think since there are economic interests, and they have all economic interests versus the West, because they all, up to a certain point, also have are commodity producers. At least most of them are commodity producers, and there maybe they will find alliances. But also, once again, more in what you already pointed out, in the economic field, yeah, negotiation of better conditions, maybe to de-dollarize the trade between the countries and going for the local currencies. Yes, on the political level, I see it more difficult. I see it more difficult. The times are over where they all shared basically this Bandung spirit. I always compare it a little bit with this conference in Bandung, when the newly freed countries basically had a common political agenda, and that was maintaining their political independence, gaining spaces in the political arena. The political systems are different. I mean, think about the political system of Argentina, India, and Brazil versus the political systems of China, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. Yeah, that's even a monarchy, an absolute monarchy. When you point out this contradiction on the political level, but there are more shared interests in the economic field. Remember things like climate change, for example, decarbonization, when obviously Western countries tend basically to force global South countries to have a very tough path of reduction of CO2 emissions, basically doing this in a very short period of time. Meanwhile, they could develop themselves based on the exploitation of nature and of human beings. We all know, obviously, the past of how Europe, as Walter Rodney said, on the one hand, underdeveloped Africa, and on the other hand, how Europe developed itself through Africa and Latin America and Asia. Yeah. So basically, there is now a shortcut to this possibility. You cannot exploit anymore neither nature, especially nature, in this climate change debate. So I think there they could find a common grounds of negotiating and arguing, well, now it's your turn, Global North, to go into the lead, and you have to give us certain concessions regarding climate change, for example. There I could see certain maneuver of space of negotiations. For example, think about Brazil with the Amazon arguing, well, we produce we are the lung of the world, and so you have to pay in case you would like that we are not destroying completely the rainforest, as for example you did in the Mediterranean in 300-400 years ago, and you destroyed basically the good parts of Southern Europe by building ships, and these ships we all know how they were used. So I think that could be maybe a possibility in the direction you said, where they could have a common grounds of negotiation. I could imagine.
Okay, thank you. I actually have a question. It's in relation to the relationship between European, not just the European powers, but the West and the developed South. I happen to think that BRICS has the potential to be one of the most significant challenges to the existing global order led by the West. And you begun by speaking about how the traditional relationship, one of how the West usually admonishes developing countries for many issues such as human rights. A bloc such as BRICS doesn't necessarily offer those sorts of, I'm going to say, checks on developing countries. So do you think that BRICS will sort of replace the traditional relationship that the West will have? Does it challenge the relationship between the West and developed countries?
Yes, I think so. I think it's a very important tool and instrument of channeling basically voices that are usually not heard in the West, at least not in the mainstream political sphere. I think it is very important. Actually, it is important even for those in the North that they try to understand and put themselves in a position where they say, okay, we have here now a power, or it is coming up a power that explicitly transports interests of the global South, and we have to deal with this, and we cannot neglect these voices anymore, since these voices represent a good part of the world population, a growing world population. And on the other hand, these countries, they try to articulate, yes, in specific topics. I think they can articulate interests of the global South, despite the fact what we have seen, that there are contradictions in them, inside them. But give me a break. The same goes for the European Union. As you know, the European Union, there is no single voice of the European Union. When you look at the policy of Africa, for example, the European Union towards Africa, I mean, you have France on the one hand, yeah, that is obviously policy informed by French imperialism, but you cannot say this in the same way to smaller countries. I'm not talking only about Austria, but let's talk about the medium-sized country like Poland that has a complete different outlook to Africa than France. And both are inside full members of the European Union, but you will not find the very same outlook in Poland, even in foreign policy towards Africa, than, let's say, in France. And both countries are more or less of the same size. So this means you can articulate policies, despite the fact that not all members are not all the time on the same in the same line or have the same spirit. Yeah, I just want to highlight this, especially also with the European Union. I mean, the European Union itself, what I said about BRICS and about the enlargement of BRICS, up to a certain point, you can say this also to the European Union and the enlargement of the European Union. The Europeans have also inside themselves quite a lot of different interests and also outlooks. Yeah, think about Orban, for example, a nationalist, right-wing nationalist. You don't find this person in all European statement. Yeah, you have different outlooks also inside the European Union and contradictions inside the European Union. Yeah, so I think that is something I would like to highlight. We should not only say all the time, oh, there are a lot of contradictions in this BRICS, and there is a lot of different political systems, and so they cannot find any strengths basically to speak with one voice versus the West. I don't think so. They in a given moment they can find common interests, and they can advance an agenda, like the Europeans are doing this also. Yeah, at the end they are doing this also. For example, the African policy, the policy of the European Union towards Africa. As I said, you can have a guy like Sarkozy in the old time when he toppled Gaddafi. That was basically done by France. That was not backed up by EU policy, for example. Yeah. So
certainly your insights, taking on the perspective of the EU and sharing with our viewers different perspective, that has been quite insightful. And I'm sure that we will invite you back to share some more views on the BRICS, especially given the fact that we will soon have the BRICS Plus with the 11 countries, moving away from 5 countries to 11 countries. So thank you once again for joining us, and I look forward to having this conversation with you again.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me and having me. And greetings, saludos to Jamaica. I am looking forward to meet you again there on your beautiful island. Thank you so much.
Thanks to Johannes for joining us. And we now take a break, and we'll be back with our key takeaways from this discussion. Come journey with us as we explore the life and science of the Caribbean and its diaspora. I am Ian Boxall. Welcome to Caribbean Explore. Welcome back to our global conversations. And today's topic is BRICS, and particularly the expansion of BRICS from 5 countries to 11 countries. So, Andrew and Akeem, based on what you've heard thus far on the program, what are your key takeaways? If I can get one from each of you, and I'll give you mine.
Well, what I'd say is my key takeaway is that BRICS, as it stands, does not seem like something that's sustainable, one, but mostly it's not sustainable in the sense of the political ambitions of the countries are very different. Now, the way that Russia is acting right now currently with the crisis in Ukraine, that signals different political ambition, and then India themselves have political ambitions to align with both the G7 and the countries in BRICS, which is quite a contradiction in itself. And then you have China, who simply likes the addition of other countries because it expands their economic reach and their level of trade. I think that the two projects they have going on right now in Saudi Arabia, billion dollar projects by the way in Saudi Arabia, one nuclear one in Saudi Arabia and another one in Iran as well for airport extension. So it tells me that the different countries in BRICS, as Professor Dr. Johnson said earlier, is that they don't want to use BRICS as a kind of escape for Western sanctions. But in BRICS in itself, internally, they all have ambitions that differ from one another, and they're trying to pursue these ambitions, but yet still find that solid ground for economic cooperation, which is very difficult. And that's why I have the premise, and I'm going to leave the premise here, that this does not seem sustainable for future cooperation between these countries unless they can find that political common ground or that political compromise between all of them that's going to allow them to compete with the West.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it remains to be seen, the longevity of BRICS. It remains to be seen how well they will be able to streamline their differences into one common objective that could contribute to a long-lasting, successful economic forum that can challenge the United States and the West, which is, of course, headed by the United States. Irrespective of that, however, I think if they get it right, it offers significant benefit for whoever could potentially join it. Not only for the adversaries of the United States who are seeking to evade the sanctions associated with the dollar. I think it offers significant potential for other countries in areas of trade, developmental assistance, getting access to more favorable loans, and distancing themselves from Western-led international organizations that usually have significant conditionalities that are often financially disastrous to these countries. Argentina, one of the new members of BRICS, is a key case in point. The IMF has been criticized over many years for many of the conditions imposed upon the assistance given to them. I think this further offers significant potential for Caribbean states. As of now, South-to-South cooperation has significant potential for the development of a country. So I think it is something that Jamaica and other developed states in the Caribbean and other parts of the world should look into. Now, of course, the key thing is balancing the interest between the countries in BRICS, many of whom are adversaries of the West, and your partner and the existing partnership between the United States. I think the closer we get to BRICS, the more admonition we'll get from the United States. So I think there's significant potential if they get it right. And whether or not they'll get it right, that remains to be seen.
Thank you. I'm going to be slightly more optimistic and suggest that BRICS or BRICS Plus, will become a much more important bloc with the 11 countries. If you think about the G7, the G20, none of these actually, or as Johannes Maerk said earlier, these countries had conflicting interests and they also had different ways of approaching the development agenda. BRICS is in the same sort of situation, and of course we know that China, India, and Russia have specific objectives within that grouping, but nonetheless, I think where they converge is in the area of trying to offer an alternative to the dominant Western hegemonic situation. And I think as we live in a world which is changing and transforming very rapidly, that emerging BRICS Plus will become more important in helping to determine development of many nations. So my takeaway here is that BRICS Plus, that is to say the BRICS Plus, 5 plus, the 6, which gives us 11, in the coming years will emerge as a very important bloc and will become a very key player in determining how countries, particularly those in the South, can conduct their affairs in a very complex world economy. So that is my takeaway. And we will see, as both of you have said, what happens in the future. Thank you for joining us on our Global Conversations. Be sure to send us your feedback on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. We also invite you to become a subscriber to our channel, our YouTube channel. Join us again next week as we explore yet another exciting topic here on Carib Explorer channel. Until then, remain curious.